Let's go ahead and begin now our talk on olfaction, which is smell. Have you guys ever seen this dog before on Instagram or social media? Such an awesome dog, just insanely long nose. So thought it was very suiting for this lecture. So this is the overview of the things that we're going to be covering. We're going to be talking about just the organization of all the structures that are involved in olfaction. We're going to discuss the vomer-nasal pathway. It's going to be especially more pronounced in like rodents and other animals like that, not as much in humans, but we do have a more rudimentary vomer-nasal pathway compared to other animals that really rely heavily on their sense of smell to navigate the world. We're going to talk about behavioral and psychological responses to different types of chemical stimuli. We're going to discuss G protein coupled receptors. We're going to discuss some conditions like anosmia, which is where you lose your sense of smell. That can be due to either trauma or infection, which we'll discuss that in a little bit. We're going to talk about the regenerative properties of these structures because these, the neurons you'll find in the olfactory system can regenerate, unlike a lot of other neurons you find within the central nervous system. So they're constantly changing over, when you acquire a taste or acquire a smell, that's because you have lots of neuronal plasticity as well as neuronal regeneration. We're going to discuss the different types of receptor genes very briefly. We're not going to go too much in detail with genetics in this class, but we'll touch on it. And then we're going to go into comparison between humans and other animals. So the olfactory system is going to respond to odorants. Odorants are going to be chemicals that are floating around that are associated with different types of scents and smells. The odorants are going to have to bind to the olfactory epithelium, right? That's going to be what's basically exposed to the external environment all the way at the very superior portion of your nasal cavity. And so you're going to have binding of odorants, which will eventually stimulate the olfactory nerve, which is your cranial nerve number 1. So they're going to also cross, these nerves are going to cross through the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate just basically has a bunch of little holes in it, and that's where you have those projections of the neurons coming from the olfactory bulb. Eventually, those neurons come into contact with the actual olfactory bulb itself, and the olfactory bulb basically sits above the cribriform plate. It's going to be the first portion of your cranial nerve number 1, and then eventually it's going to reach the piriform cortex as well as other areas within the brain where those scents and those odors are going to be processed. Now, recall, with olfaction, the neuron, cranial nerve 1, is going to bypass the thalamus. So this is the only cranial nerve that's not going to be routed through the thalamus for further processing. It's going to go straight into cortical processing as well as memory formation within the hippocampus. And so here's the overall pathway of odorants. So you have the receptors, and then you see the olfactory nerve is going to be involved in receiving that information. Then you're going to have the olfactory bulb sending information back to different parts of the brain, including regions of the limbic system. Now, why do you think it's important for olfaction to eventually reach the limbic system, especially regions like the amygdala? Why would that be important? Yeah, why would fear be important when it comes to smell? Yeah, don't eat that, but also even like the smell of potential predators, perhaps, right? Things that might be a potential threat in the environment. But definitely food is going to be one of the major things, right? Trying to avoid things that might be potentially toxic. And there's other regions too. So again, you have the cortical regions, the piriform cortex, right? And then a lot of these areas are going to communicate. Now from those target areas also communicate with other regions in the brain. So you have in the hippocampus, that's where you get finally memory consolidation of those different types of smells. It's also going to be, signals are going to be sent to different areas of the cortex, so like the orbitofrontal cortex, that's the front part of the frontal lobe. The thalamus is also going to come into play eventually, right? It doesn't go directly through the thalamus, but eventually it's going to communicate with the thalamus as well as the hypothalamus. And those are going to be centers that basically allow you to figure out what to do as a reaction to a smell, right? You put that smell into memory, but then your brain also has to figure out what it's going to do as a reaction, right? That's why, for example, the frontal cortex is going to come into play, right? You're going to have higher executive function saying, what do we do with this information? You have to do something with that new information. So here's the vomer nasal system. So what does the vomer actually mean? It literally translates from Latin to a plow. So it's shaped like a plow. So it's a very thin, bony structure that sits in our nasal cavity. And it basically separates both right and left sides of the nasal cavity. For us, this whole system is not going to be as prominent. Again, other animals are going to rely much more heavily on olfaction. So if you, for example, look at a sheep brain, or if you look at a cat brain or a dog brain, any of those animals are going to be using their olfactory system much more than humans do. So if you did like a side-by-side comparison, the olfaction bulb or the olfactory bulb in the human is going to be way smaller than it would be, relatively speaking, compared to that of a dog or a cat. So the vomer nasal organ is something you see much more prominent in other types of mammals, carnivores, as well as rodents. And so you're going to have lots of receptor cells within the vomer nasal organ. These are going to respond to different types of scents. So good to know what these are. So pheromones, that's going to be the type of scents that allow for animals to interact socially. So that could be sexual, right? So finding a mate, for example. It could also just be other pro-social type of scents, right? Helping individuals distinguish maybe friend from foe, or being able to identify individuals that would be an optimal mate, right? Humans probably have certain capacity when it comes to pheromones. I mean, there's been lots of famous studies that were done in the past, having women smell the sweaty shirts of different guys, and just by the smell alone, they were able to identify the guys that they found to be more attractive if they actually looked at them, right? So just the scent was able to indicate compatibility. And there's a lot of interesting research that's been done on that. Some of it has to do with HLA typing. HLA is whenever you do like typing of like an organ transplant, you're going to do HLA typing. Now, that means you're finding a match, right? So your immune system doesn't attack the organ that you're receiving. But smell and finding mates can also come into play with HLA. HLA typing for like mate selection can actually be the opposite. So in order to maximize genetic fitness, generally speaking, people want to mate with an individual that has a different type of genetic sequence than they do, right? The reason being is because if you have too much like kind of like inbreeding, right? If you have inbreeding, you're going to have more like recessive type of genes. And so smell has actually been linked to HLA typing, which is super interesting. So you're generally going to want to try to mate with somebody who's like a little bit different than you are in general, right? So you maximize the fitness of the children. So we probably have a bit of like pheromone detection, but still there needs to be a lot more research into that field. I think it's like super cool stuff. Then you have chiromones, which is the way that predators are able to sniff out their prey. So that's chiromones. And other regions that are going to be involved in the brain, like the hypothalamus, the whole goal for those regions to be involved is to basically figure out a way to establish homeostasis, right? That's where the hypothalamus comes into play. So any questions on that? Cool. So here's that system. This is in a rodent. So you have the vomer nasal organ in the rodent. So this is what detects pheromones, chiromones, right? Pheromones for pro-social interaction, chiromones for predator-prey detection. And they're going to project to different regions, right? So you're going to see they're projecting to the accessory olfactory bulb. And so again, this is going to be a structure that you don't really see in in primate type of animals, right? You're going to see this more in non-primate type of animals. And so here's the accessory olfactory bulb. So you have those vomer nasal organ receptors sending information to the accessory olfactory bulb. but it's also going to communicate with similar regions that your regular olfactory bulb will communicate with, aka the amygdala, right? Hypothalamus, right? This is also going to involve other areas like the stria terminalis. So that's a different region in these type of animals, like rodents, for example. So you're going to have a little bit of a different process when it comes to pheromones and pheromones. Now, when we talk about the physiological behavioral responses to smells, right, a lot of that has to do with food, right? You're trying to smell what might be good to consume, something that's not going to be toxic, something that's not going to kill you. You can also see mood being affected by smells. I'm going to show you guys some really interesting studies that talk about how even like political views can change depending on whether or not you're smelling something pleasant versus smelling something absolutely repulsive and disgusting. There's a lot of disgust mechanisms that come into play, even with like psychological perception and viewpoints, right, that can actually change due to smells. So that's really weird stuff, but it's awesome research territory. There's lots of cool research going into that. Arousal can also be involved in that, right? This could also be involved in, for example, like mate selection. Social approach, meaning if you're dealing with individuals that are actually like friend versus foe, right? People that you want to interact with. And then, of course, avoidance of danger is going to be a huge aspect of olfaction as well. So here are a couple different structures. So you have the olfactory receiving neurons, and those are going to be what transduce those signals. They transduce chemical signals into electrical signals. That's what gets relayed to the brain, to the central nervous system. You also have glands that are going to secrete mucus, so that allows for odorants to basically attach to the olfactory receptors. This can also be involved in defense, right? There could be, whenever you're breathing stuff in, you're breathing in all sorts of stuff. You're breathing in bacteria, viruses, you're breathing in fungal spores, right? There's going to be a lot of immune system function within the respiratory system, throughout the respiratory system. Sustentacular cell. Sustentacular just means supportive. When we say sustentacular, it means supporting type cells. These in the olfactory system are going to help neutralize things if they're potentially dangerous. And then again, you have the mucosa, which is going to involve all these different structures plus a lamina propria. Lamina propria, that's going to be kind of the like a suspensory type tissue region where you're going to find blood vessels and things like that. So here's the cribriform plate on the bottom. Down here you would have the receptors, right, that will receive the signals from the odorants, and then that signal gets transmitted through the cribriform plate to the olfactory receptor neurons. So here are different cells you might find within the olfactory system. You have neurons, obviously, right, because that's going to be sending signals, chemical signals into electrical signals. Again, you have supporting cells. You also have glial cells that are basically, acting as like immune type defense as well as just support. And then you have those mucus cells and then stem cells. Remember, the olfactory system can regenerate, right? Even if it gets damaged, it can regenerate. How many of you guys had COVID during 2020 and you lost completely your sense of smell and your taste? How long did it take for it to get back?
Like after I got better, probably 2 weeks, but there were still like certain foods that taste weird to me, like dark soda tastes like dirt.
Really? That's still to this day?
Yeah, never went back.
Wow. Yeah. Most of your olfactory receptors will come back, right? They'll regenerate. But like you said, sometimes the smells and tastes will forever be affected. Like for me, I actually got full odor capabilities back, but for about a month and a half, 2 months, things did taste really weird, like really weird. For example, like, I like pipe tobacco. The pipe tobacco I used to really love, and I still do, tasted gross for like 2 months. Mm-hmm. Same thing with certain foods, just tasted gross for a couple months. But then eventually, for me, it eventually came back.
My older sister couldn't smell for like a year.
Oh, wow. That's horrible.
Starting to come back now.
Some people got some more significant effects.
Yeah.
from COVID. Some people, their smell was barely affected. I knew some folks who their smell and taste maybe went away for a couple of days. Others went away for a long time, a few weeks, month,
Do you think that that's
to a
because
year.
of like the strain of COVID that people have? Or
It could be just due. It could be due to a lot. I mean, so many things could be involved in that.
does that actively lose their taste and smell when they get sick?
Uh, yes, definitely, because if you get congested sinuses, right, that's going to affect your perception of taste. But when it came to COVID, it specifically targeted the ACE receptors that you find within the respiratory epithelium, and so because of that, it was actually like wiping out and obliterating a lot of these olfactory neurons. And so, yeah, I think COVID in particular was different when it came to how it affected taste and smell because it really did wipe out those nerves. But those nerves, they would grow back. I mean, you have stem cells in there, so it helps to regenerate those areas. Again, the lamina propria, that's going to be a supportive region. You're going to see blood vessels in there. You're going to see other cells that are going to be found in there as well as immunological cells like macrophages. Here is some FYI that you can read through on your own if you would like to get more interesting information about different regions and cell types and structures within the olfactory epithelium, but I'm not going to go through all this in detail. So here is some of the stuff that you might see again, like we were talking about how the olfactory system might be affected by trauma, could be affected by infections, but it could also be affected by certain chemicals too. These types of sprays that contain zinc, these zinc-containing sprays have been found to damage the olfactory nerves. So it can actually, for some people, be irreversible. So some people who use these types of sprays a lot will eventually maybe develop anosmia. So they might never be able to smell again. Again, viral infections, so infections that particularly target the ACE receptor. The ACE receptors are when a virus attaches to a cell, it has to bind to a receptor to gain entry. Otherwise, the virus isn't going to affect you. And most viruses in the environment don't affect us, right? Some viruses that affect us don't affect animals, right? Like if you're sick with the flu, you're not going to give it to your dog. The dog doesn't have the receptor types to bind to the influenza virus, right? And so you have to have a binding site. It just so happened, though, that the COVID virus bound to the ACE receptors that you find in respiratory epithelium. It destroyed these supporting cells, the sustentacular cells, and it caused a lot of inflammation in those regions. The neurons were affected, causing anosmia. So here was a study where they're looking at different types of chemicals to see how they would affect the respiratory epithelia. So they used saline, they used drugs like epinephrine, lidocaine, but zinc gluconate, ones from those zinc nasal sprays, that's the one that actually affected those cells. And so, again, if you use those on a regular basis, you could induce permanent irreversible anosmia. It's like a nasal spray, dietary supplement. At least this is what this one is over here. Huh? There's other sprays too. Like there's a spray that I like to use, fluticasone, but it's a corticosteroid. So if you have like really bad allergies or congestion, you can use a fluticasone nasal spray, and that helps to reduce inflammation. But that's just a corticosteroid. It doesn't have zinc. But if you use anything with zinc in it, that could be potentially damaging. I mean, I've never used zinc nasal sprays before, so yeah, I don't know. So here's COVID again, affecting those sustentacular cells. And if you disrupt olfaction, you're going to disrupt taste, right? Because they're very intimately connected with each other. And so this study over here, they did different labeling in terms of fluorescence. So you can see the different types of cells that were infected. So the red area over here, those are all the epithelial cells, the respiratory cells that were affected by COVID-19. So here's a little bit more information about the vomer nasal organ, and you have the vomer nasal receptors as well. Again, these structures are mostly pronounced in other animals, right? Rodents, for example, and they're going to respond to pheromones, chiromones. And these are going to have different effects than actual odorants. Right? This is not necessarily detecting different smells. This is detecting chemicals that are responsible for either social interaction or for predator-prey dynamics. Again, if you have damage to the olfactory bulb, it might not be a big deal. You might get temporary anosmia. Oftentimes, sense of smell will return, even if it sometimes returns a little bit skewed, where things smell a little bit different than they used to. So this could happen with trauma, bacterial infections, viral infections, etc. But then again, lots of cells, stem cells, that are going to be able to regenerate these different tissues. Right? You also have these olfactory unsheathing cells, which are going to aid in the development of new olfactory neurons. Here are some of the different types of transcription factors that are involved in the growth and development of these respiratory olfactory neurons. So you have, for example, SOX2, which we talked about in the past. Right? Those important transcription factors for differentiation of different types of neurons. But there's a bunch of other transcription factors. I am not going to hold you guys accountable for these. So this is FYI if you want to delve even deeper into this type of stuff. So when odorants are binding to the receptors on cilia versus the soma, so different parts of the odorant detectors are going to respond in greater chemical and electrical signaling. So if you bind odorants to the cilia of these cells, then you're going to see more of a electrical signal being sent. So the cilia have a lot of surface area to bind to. So that's going to be where you get the maximum amount of binding of odorants. You can also see odorants binding to different parts of the cell, including like the soma, for example. Soma just meaning the cell body. But the overall electrical signal as a result of that is not going to be as pronounced. So in other words, the cilia are the regions where you have the maximized surface area to maximize a electrical signal. So you get a much larger depolarization compared to if you bind to the soma itself. Now, G protein receptors. So this is a G protein coupled receptor. A lot of your odorants are going to bind to the G protein receptors, and then you get a signal transduction. Right? You get all sorts of secondary messengers coming into play. The G protein receptor has different areas on it. So it has the N terminus, which is going to be outside of the cell. It has a C terminus on the inside of the cell. It has a bunch of transmembrane domains. Do I want you guys to remember all that? No, not necessarily. But that's just how those G protein receptors are structured in the respiratory epithelium. And then you also have variable regions. And the variable regions are basically what respond to different types of odorants. And so each of these receptors will respond to something different.
Fact number 6 binds at the null cycles.
Which one?
Subunit 6.
Of the transmembrane protein. It binds to adenyl cyclase. Which class is that from?
Advanced biochemistry.
Wow. Yeah. That's one of the things I want to avoid in this class is turning it to advanced biochem. And genetics. Yeah, I want to try to avoid that as much as I possibly can. But anyways, this is how those different G protein receptors are going to be transcribed and translated. You have different genes that are going to be producing these different types of receptors. And again, I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. Yeah, this dog is cute. I actually made it in, I made this in Midjourney. So I used Midjourney a lot for like AI generated images. So I tried to find a cool dog on the internet with like a lab coat and stethoscope. I didn't find any good ones. So Burton, Midjourney really did a good job at creating this for me. So it does. You have a husky. Oh, huskies are awesome. Yeah, I actually put in specifically husky doctor. So Dr. Dog, the doctor is in. Dogs can actually sniff out cancer. They can sniff out a lot of things. And actually, some people, there's been stories about some people who can actually sniff out things like different diseases in people. There's this one lady, I think she was a nurse. I think she was a nurse, but I know she worked in the healthcare field. She could sniff out Parkinson's disease. If a person had Parkinson's, she could sniff it out. If a person didn't even have symptoms yet, they just like had the risk factors or the genetics to it. And there was like one instance where like the person didn't have Parkinson's, but then they like later on they actually developed Parkinson's. So this lady was able to perceive different odors. And so there's actually been studies done on her to see what's going on with her really interesting and unique skill. But animals, they have like much better and accurate scent detection than we do. So let's watch a little video on this. This is pretty cool.
Dogs watch us all the time.
If only.
No other animal does.
He senses whenever we're going to go out, and he knows before we even make a move.
They read our body language, and that's how they know we're going to take them for a walk, before we think we've made the decision ourselves. It's this constant observation that can sometimes appear to give them a sixth sense. Max is a red collie cross, normally full of energy and enthusiasm. But in 2008, his owner, Maureen Burns, noticed that something was wrong.
I thought at the time Max was fading. He was 9.5. And I was preparing myself for losing him because he just wasn't happy. Wouldn't come with me, wouldn't sit by me, wouldn't sit on my lap. And the odd signs, he would come up and touch my breast with his nose and back off, so desperately unhappy that there's such a sad look in his eyes.
Maureen had a small lump in her breast, but her latest mammogram was clear, so she presumed all was okay.
Initially I thought, it's just another lumpy breast as people get. But then I sort of connected it with the dog, with his odd behaviour. And one day I was looking in the mirror in the bedroom here, and I looked across in the mirror at Max's eyes. He was on the bed, as he is now, and I knew it was cancer.
Maureen went to her local hospital, but both a scan and a mammogram came back negative. It took a surgical biopsy to finally detect the cancer. Maureen had it removed, and the change in Max's behaviour was instant.
The day I was picked up from the hospital, he was his old hyper self again. He put his nose across my breast to check where the operation had been, and he was wagging his tail and his eyes were happy, and it was unbelievable, the change in him. Instant. I love Max so much, and I owe him so much. And even before I go for a checkup now, I get him to check me out. And if he's happy and wagging his tail, I'm happy. And I know I'm okay.
We now know that dogs like Max are smelling the tiny volatile chemicals given off by cancerous tumours. Most dogs can do this. They just don't know that we're interested. But with a little training, dogs can accurately pick out a cancerous patient from a selection of urine samples.
Girl.
They can even be taught to let diabetics like Stephen know that his blood sugar levels are smelling low, long before he can feel it, and definitely before he passes out. Dogs like Stephen's are now transforming lives all over the country. They're being trained to detect the early warning signals for severe allergic reactions, epileptic fits, and narcolepsy.
So that is one of the reasons also that dogs are being used as service animals for epileptics. You know, they can literally sniff it out before the seizure starts. They can actually detect it and warn the owner, yeah, you're about to have a seizure. Maybe go sit down because it's going to happen. So it's super cool. And again, they can do this with a lot of accuracy. So if you train a dog to sniff these things out, they can actually detect it with a lot of accuracy. So really amazing stuff. I mean, dogs in general will have, way more receptor sites. If you did, like I said, if you look at the olfactory bulb in dogs and cats and all other animals like that, you'll see that it's way larger than ours. So odor receptors, so you have canonical odor receptors. So this is a family of odor receptors and genes, and you're going to find this in a lot of different types of animals, not just vertebrates like ourselves, but you also find that in insects, for example, invertebrates. You have also ionotropic receptors, and that's going to detect volatile chemicals. So ionotropic responding to different ions, for example. And then you also have receptors that are going to also detect volatile chemicals like trace amine associated receptors. And those are going to be kind of similar to some of your G protein coupled receptors as well. This is all FYI. Again, I'm not going to go into what's up.
Is canonical like a type of G protein?
It's going to be a family of odorant type receptors. So large family of receptors. So those are your canonical odorant receptors. So odorant binding, again, when the odor binds to the G protein coupled receptor, it's going to activate the alpha subunit, and then it's going to create a complex, which eventually activates adenyl cyclase, and then you get cyclic AMP increased, and then you get ion channels getting opened up to allow for things like sodium and calcium to come in. Chloride ions also exit, and so ultimately you get depolarization of the cell. And so this is all having to do with your primary messenger, which is the odorant, turning on a cascade of secondary messenger sequences afterwards. And these types of proteins, the G olfactory alpha is only going to be found in the olfactory system, as the name implies. I mean, olfactory is already in the name right there. So now, adaptation. So sensory receptors adjust to constant stimulation. If you are around a smell all the time, you're not going to perceive it, right? It's like if you light incense in your house or something, it smells great at first. And I light incense all the time. It smells awesome at first, but then after a while, it just kind of like becomes background noise, right? Even bad smells, like you can kind of acclimate to a really rank odor. It's called what?
Isn't it
Nose blind? Yeah. Nose blind. I never heard that before, but yeah, I guess you could call it that. Yeah. So you.
I get someone people, other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you smell it at first, right? But then you just get used to it. Like your receptors basically just acclimate and adapt to different smells.
Nose blind doesn't work, right?
I've heard that a lot of times, but probably it's a slang term.
Yeah, I've never heard that even as a slang term before. No, nose blindness. So I'll have to integrate that into my lexicon. In certain mice, you can wipe this all out, right? You can actually affect these different receptors in mice and basically reduce their ability to even detect any smells whatsoever. And so they'll lose responsiveness to different scent detections. So if you inactivate critical molecule receptors, you're going to affect the ability for the animal to smell, obviously. I mean, if you affect G, that should be lower, that should be subscript GOLF. So it looks like it says golf, but that's the G receptor in the olfactory bulb, the AC3 receptor as well. So these receptors are going to be really important for detection of smell. So these are examples of studies that they did where they completely inactivate the genes that transcribed and translated those types of proteins versus compared to the wild type. At the wild type, the animals are able to smell perfectly fine. So the olfactory receptor neurons, they're going to respond to different types of odors, right? They're all going to have different types of odors that they're more sensitive to. Sometimes these olfactory receptor neurons are only going to respond to one single smell, period, right? That's the only smell that they detect. Sometimes they can have more receptor sites to detect different types of odorants. Here's an example of studies that were done using different types of chemical compounds. In the first neuron, this first neuron was able to respond to 3 different chemical smells, chemical odorants. The second neuron over here, down below, only responded to cineole. It didn't respond to any of the other odorants whatsoever. And then similarly, the third neuron was only able to respond to 2 odorants, whereas it wasn't respond to the cineole odorant. So in other words, long story short, different different olfactory receptor neurons are going to respond to different odorants. So here's another example of studies that were done using different types of odorants and checking the chemical sensitivity. So back to the vomer nasal receptors. These are going to be, again, tuned in to different types of signals, whether it's smells versus your pheromones or chiromones. There's different types of classes of these receptors. So you have the V1R receptor, the V2R receptor, and they're going to respond to different types of chemical signals. The V1R receptor has a small binding site, so it's, in other words, it would need to have like a lot of those odorants available to be able to actually get activated, versus V2R has a lot more binding sites, so it would be a little bit more sensitive, right? It wouldn't take much of a chemical signal to actually turn that odorant on.
Should we know those specific?
No, I'm not going to go into absolute granular detail about the different receptor types for odorants. So just keep an eye out on the quizzes questions. Whatever I put in the quizzes questions will be like the high yield stuff that I want you to focus on. Now, again, here's another image of the vomer nasal nerves, as well as the vomer nasal organ, which is going to be basically associated with the olfactory bulb. Then you have the main olfactory bulb and the accessory olfactory bulb. Recall, the accessory olfactory bulb is mostly going to be dealing with the chiromones and pheromone sensory processing. So that will probably be more important, stuff like that, right? More bigger picture type scenarios. There's also the glomeruli. So you have a glomerulus, which is basically going to be a region where you're having synapse formation. So the glomerulus is going to be right underneath the surface of the actual bulb itself. And you're going to have a bunch of different synapses as well as dendrites within those glomeruli. And they're going to synapse onto mitral cells. And then mitral cells are going to send axonal signals down the olfactory bulb. And then you're going to have different types of effects coming from, depending on what receptor sites were activated. So here are the projections from the vomer nasal organ. Again, it involves the cilia. Remember, the cilia is where you have binding to the odorants. Then you have the olfactory receptor, and it's sending the signal down to the synapse, which is going to be where you have the glomerulus. The glomerulus is where you have synaptic connection with the mitral cell, which eventually sends signals all the way down the axons, right? And then the axons are going to go all the way back to different regions in the brain to help process those different odorants. And for rodents that have their accessory olfactory bulb, again, that's going to help in establishing different behavior patterns, right? For example, if a rodent smelled the scent of cat urine, generally speaking, that rodent would be frightened and would go off and run away and hide. There are certain circumstances, though, where rodents can actually be turned on by cat urine. Are you guys familiar? Have you guys taken microbiology here? Have you guys learned about toxoplasmosis? Yeah. So toxoplasmosis, which is going to be found in cat litter, right? Cat droppings. Toxoplasmosis is a parasite, basically, that hijacks the brains of rodents, which makes them more attracted to the scent of cat urine. Yeah, it's teratogenic to the developing fetus in utero. And it can also be very dangerous for people who are immunocompromised. So HIV, AIDS patients need to be very careful with toxoplasmosis. But if you're a rodent, it's going to basically make the rodent really like the smell of cat urine. So basically, it's going to kind of hijack this whole entire system, right? So it's going to make it from a threat to an actual thing that they're attracted to. So odorants are going to be used, again, for homeostasis. They're going to be used for survival mechanisms. They're also going to be involved in learning, right? That's why all these systems are going to be communicating with the hippocampus, the amygdala, the limbic system, right? So it allows for learning what things might be threatful, right? Threatening things in the environment. So that's one of the major purposes of this whole system. And again, check out the difference, relatively speaking, of the rat's olfactory bulb compared to the human olfactory bulb. It's massive. It looks like it's about 1/5, about 1/6 maybe, of the size of the entire brain of the rat. It's a massive region. Right? Compare that to our olfactory bulb. It's way smaller in comparison. Like when you compare the rest of the cortex to the actual olfactory bulb. So really interesting stuff. So those regions are all going to be very important for behavior. Again, other animals, they're going to be more receptive to different odorants, much more so than we are. So they're going to have more of those olfactory receptor neurons, more receptors, more cilia. They're going to have a larger surface area in the olfactory epithelium. The regions of the brain that are associated with olfaction are going to be much more larger and pronounced in other animals. So here's those olfactory receptor neurons compared between different animals. So bloodhound is going to have a lot more so even than just regular dogs, like a typical dog. And then compare that to a rat, which is going to be a lot less, right? And then compare that to a human, right? Humans are going to be not as sensitive to different types of odors. However, humans can develop their ability to smell and even track. There's been lots of studies done on animals, comparing animals to dogs, where they can like literally trace an odor across a field and then have an individual go around on their hands and knees trying to see where that odor is tracing to. Right? There was I was listening to this really interesting interview of one of the researchers that like created these studies, and he would literally have his research students on their campus at their university, like on their hands and knees, like crawling around the grass, like sniffing the ground. So like people are like, what the? I know, it's super embarrassing, but it's fascinating that they found that the olfactory acuity, like the ability for them to actually like detect certain smells, and like if you train your nose, you can actually do a lot of the things that dogs do, which is pretty amazing. But I mean, needless to say though, dogs still have way more olfactory capabilities than we do, right? Way more of those receptor neurons than we do.
You know what's really funny? I get shit on my parents for smelling almost everything I put in my mouth.
Really? Like whenever they cook food and stuff?
Yeah, like it's just the innate thing that I do. They're like, oh, like it does smelling your food.
Do they get offended?
I think they do. I'm like, get over it.
Are you doing that because you get grossed out if it smells funky?
I still eat it.
Yeah.
I
I mean, there's things that smell terrible, but they still taste great, like cheeses.
yeah.
Cheese is like one of those things where some cheeses smell so gross, like repulsive, but then you eat it and you're like, wow, that tastes so much different than it smells.
Or like kimchi, sometimes it smells odd, but it tastes good.
And I don't think I've ever had kimchi before. But yeah, there's certain things that just smell terrible, but they taste great. But yeah, I mean, the sense of smell is an interesting thing, especially when you compare it to the actual sense of taste and gustatory sensation. So pretty interesting stuff. So here's another FYI, if you want to read into it in more detail, this is where they different studies on like detection of smells. So some people can actually detect smells. They can train themselves to detect smells at lower concentrations. You have to train yourself. But even if you don't train, even if the smell, the odorant is in a high enough concentration, you're eventually going to start smelling that, right? But people who are like sommeliers, for example, when they do like wine, they train on like smelling wine, they can smell and detect just like even the area of the world where those grapes were grown. They can detect different types of like chemical components of the actual soil where those grapes were grown. So people can be trained on that. It's just basically exposure, right? So here's how smell can also play into hedonic behavior. So hedonism in general just means like the pursuit of pleasure, right? And so taste, smell, that can also fall into those types of behaviors, right? Of hedonic type pleasure. And the regions in the brain that are going to be associated with that, there's the orbitofrontal region as well as the cingulate cortex. So the cingulate cortex is the area that's like directly outside of the corpus callosum. So you have the corpus callosum right here, and then you have the cingulate cortex. And the cingulate cortex is going to be involved in a lot of things like behavior, right? It's going to interact very much with like the frontal lobe, for example. So it's going to be involved in a lot of similar type of functions like regulating higher level behaviors. Right? So the cingulate cortex is going to be also involved in detection of things that are potentially pleasant versus things that are potentially unpleasant, right? And so it's going to be moderating those types of processes. Now, these studies, there's been studies done with infants as well as with rodents, as well as with monkeys when it comes to the scent of smells. Maybe it has to do with like the pleasurable scent of the smell, or even maybe just like the pheromones that might be associated with those different compounds. So like breast secretions, for example. Infants are able to actually recognize their mom by smelling breast milk. So that's one of the things where you can get like that bonding connection between mother and child. So really, really interesting stuff. So infants can smell based upon the close proximity of their nose to the areola, right? So that's absolutely amazing. And then what are the effects that this elicits in the child? It's going to cause things like tongue protrusion, right? Different types of reactions, which are going to help to allow for the baby to breastfeed, right? Latch reflex and all that. This will not happen if they're exposed to someone else's breast milk, right? So it has to be mom's. There's going to be a difference between males and females in reaction to different types of smells. So it could have to do with androgens as well as estrogens, causing different types of reactions to smells, but that is low yield. I'm not going to test you on that. Anosmia, however, is something that you should definitely be familiar with. So anosmia, you're not able to distinguish odors. Again, that can be caused by lots of things: trauma, infections, inflammation, toxins, right? Like zinc, right? Zinc nasal spray. People can be born with anosmia congenitally. And something that's really interesting about people born with anosmia is that there's been a link between anosmia and psychopathy, right? Part of the olfactory system is also developing in tandem with the frontal lobe. And as you guys remember from way back in the beginning of the semester, when we watched that video with Jim Fallon, the professor that was studying psychopathy, a lot of it had to do with reduction in frontal lobe activation. So if you don't have proper functioning olfaction congenitally, it's very possible that you also didn't develop very well in terms of your frontal lobe function. And so that could potentially increase the risk of developing psychopathy. Over time, as you get older and older, you can get age-related decline, right? And even like if you talk to old people, sometimes like their diet gets a little weird. Like they don't really enjoy eating the things that they used to really enjoy eating. Sometimes they'll even start eating more bland foods in general, just because they don't really have much taste going on. Sometimes they just prefer to eat crackers. Sometimes they just prefer to eat things that are kind of like sweet, maybe, right? But their overall taste in general just really changes as they get older. Other things might affect smell, like obviously brain tumors. If you have a neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc., all those things can affect your ability to smell and taste. Let me see if this video is worth watching.
Today's topic is anosmia. Anosmia is the partial or complete loss of the sense of smell.
So basically, this is just reiterating everything I just said. So you guys can feel free to watch that video on your own if you would like later on. Again, these, if you have anosmia, it could be permanent. right? That's only if those olfactory receptor neurons do not come back. So some people really do permanently lose their smell. And here's the connection between anosmia and psychopathy. This is specifically with congenital anosmia. This is not like, oh, I lost my sense of smell when I was 20 years old. Am I going to be a serial killer now? It's like, no, it's had to be during development when you were born. All right, so you're born with that. So people with psychopathic tendencies have an impaired sense of smell, which points to inefficient processing in the front part of the brain, i.e. the frontal lobe. They have difficulty experiencing emotions like fear and disgust. So, in other words, they have a hard time with empathy, right? That's one of the hallmarks of psychopathy, reduction in empathy. You inflict harm on other people and you just don't feel bad about it whatsoever. I had a colleague of mine, he thinks he might be slightly sociopathic, but he actually, what he did was kind of sociopathic. He shot a dove with his BB gun that was bothering him. It was like crapping on his roof, and he was getting annoyed by the sound the dove was making, so he went outside and he shot it with a BB gun. I was like, dude, that's ridiculous. Why'd you do that? And he was like, I felt terrible after that. Like, he saw the bird fall down, and he was like twitching, and he had to load it again so he could like put it out of its misery. And he's like, he almost cried. And I'm like, wow. He's like, well, at least I know I'm not a sociopath. Right? He at least like felt emotions. But I'm like, you had to do that to realize you're not a sociopath? Like, you could just let the poor bird alone, dude. What the heck is wrong with you, man? So anyways, I still think he's a sociopath, though.